Well, hope one of the things that came across in the first talk was that the issue of abortion can't be separated from the broader issue of really what it means to be a human being. And if you were to ask me what characterizes our present age, I would say it is characterized by a rapidly changing and even perhaps highly unstable notion of what it means to be a human. What I want to do in this lecture is break that down into three elements that will allow me, I think, then in the second half to pivot to three areas where I think the church, and I actually think the Anglican Church, it hurts me to say this as a Presbyterian, but I think the Anglican Church is, at least in one of these areas, uniquely, perhaps among Protestant denominations, with the possible exception of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, has a huge advantage. But what I want to really offer is a vision of the church as the place where the imaginations of people are formed in a very countercultural way. Going back to one of the latter questions after my last talk, how do we train our children in this? Well, it may sound a rather trite answer, but I am going to suggest in this that one of the ways we bring our children up to understand the truth and to have the rightly attuned cultural intuitions is to make sure they attend good church regularly. It sounds trite, but I think the New Testament sets forth the church as the answer. And I want to give a bit more detail on that and explain why I think that's the case, but I think that is central to it. And as I say, I've got I joked when I gave a version of this talk to the mere Anglicans yesterday that knowing I'm speaking to an Anglican conference, I have 3 points and then 3 counterpoints. It's like 2 sermons combined into one. First of all, that just again to stress the big questions of our day, I think, circle around the question of what it means to be human. And I would suggest that one of the things that makes that question complicated is the fact that of all creatures on the face of the planet, the who question, who am I, and the what question, what am I, are sort of more separate, or potentially a lot more separate than they are for other creatures. My wife gets bored listening to me using the same analogies time after time. But using this context, the analogy, let's say I'm going to change from the analogy of the fox, but to an analogy of a beaver. A beaver builds a dam. Beavers dam rivers, but they do it instinctively. It's hardwired into them. If you see a beaver, you know that if you put a beaver down by a riverside, sooner or later he's going to build a dam. Human beings, we build bridges. We design bridges. We make bridges that perhaps aren't just functional in getting us across a river, but have a particular look. If you go to London and you see Tower Bridge, there's a certain magnificence to Tower Bridge. There is a surplus there beyond the mere functionality of the bridge that enhances the look of the area. We don't just make shelters to hide from the elements. We make houses that are beautiful. We fill them with things that have no function beyond simply giving us aesthetic pleasure when we look at them. We are creatures, I would say, of freedom and intention, not merely of instinct. And that's why, if I were to ask you, afterwards, tell me about yourself, none of you likely would give me your blood group and your genome. You will all tell me things that make you unique. Some of them will be things over which you have no power. You might tell me who your parents were. We don't have power over who our parents were. But many of the things you tell me will be things that connect not to any instincts you have, but to your choices. You chose to study this subject at this college, or you chose to pursue this career path, or you chose to marry this person. Choices, very important. Now, just think about that, how that complicates the kind of anthropological questions. One could say a fox is a creature that kills chickens. All foxes are creatures that kill chickens. Seen one fox deal with one chicken, you've seen every fox deal with every chicken. We can't give such a simple answer to what it means to be human, because there's such a variety of human activity. One of the glories, isn't it, of being a human being, that there is so much freedom and we experience autonomy in the way we act and think and behave. And I would say that the big problem today is this, that the who question has come to absolutely overwhelm the what question. The who question has come to overwhelm the what question. Why? Because I think three things that intrinsically characterize human beings have been rejected or overthrown or denied. And these things are this: a rejection of limits, a rejection of teleology, and if you're not familiar with the term, I'll explain what it means in a few moments, and a rejection of natural obligations. A rejection of limits, a rejection of teleology, a rejection of natural obligations. They characterize that kind of world that I was describing in the first lecture. They're different, aspects to this notion of human beings as autonomous. I think in some ways what I'm doing here is kind of drilling down and starting to, get a bit deeper, a bit more elaborate in how we think about human beings. First of all, a rejection of limits. The great philosopher of this, I think, is Friedrich Nietzsche, 19th century. Nietzsche's critique of religion and of enlightenment was very much bound up with the limits that he saw these things as falsely imposing on individuals. Many of you will be familiar with the phrase, God is dead. That occurs in Nietzsche's book, The Gay Science. The most famous passage in The Gay Science is the madman passage, where this madman rushes into a town square one morning and starts telling everybody, the atheists there, that God is dead, and all the atheists laugh at him. He's actually making a serious point. He's sort of saying to the atheist, you've got rid of God, but you haven't followed through. What does he mean by that? Well, the beginning of that section of The Gay Science begins with his anecdote of the Buddha. And Nietzsche says, after Buddha died, his shadow remained on the wall of a cave for many centuries. A great, awesome, terrifying shadow. And then he says, and we too have our shadows. God is dead. What does he mean? He means that after Buddha died, his influence remained, inhibiting people. This shadow terrified them. And he's really, in that section of The Gay Science, going to engage in a polemic against Christianity and say, the great Enlightenment philosophers, they got rid of God, but they put something else in its place. They put human nature in its place to inhibit and restrict how human beings act. And he's making the point that, guess what? Human nature is actually a concept that depends upon God. And what he's really doing there for the atheist is saying, you cannot get rid of God and carry on as if nothing else has changed. We might say, the death of God is not like the death of the last dodo. When the dodo bird dies out, well, the world has one less creature in it, but carries on pretty much the same. Nietzsche's making, I think, a very profound and truthful point. Saying, you can't get rid of God and then just carry on with your morality as if nothing's changed. What you're doing is you're getting rid of one tyrant, God, and replacing him with another tyrant, human nature. And what Nietzsche is calling for there, he calls for what he calls the transvaluation of all values. Human beings themselves have to rise up and take the place of God. They have to will reality at this point. They have to break free from their constraints. Nietzsche thinks that the death of God presents human beings with two possibilities. You can either be the last man or you can be the overman. sometimes translated as the Superman. Unfortunately, that has Marvel comic kind of connotations now. The Übermensch, to use the German. The last man is just what Nietzsche would dismiss as a passive nihilist. He just carries on with the old routines as if nothing's changed. The passive man is the last man. It's the guy who just sits in front of the television, staring at the box, never thinking for himself. Carry on with life as usual. Or you can be the overman and realize that to be yourself, you must transgress. You've got to break with these old, now groundless values, because that is the way of authenticating yourself. If I ever taught systematic theology, which thankfully I've never been asked to do, but if I did, I would always want to include novels in teaching it. If you read Crime and Punishment, Nietzsche loved Crime and Punishment, the book by Dostoevsky. Raskolnikov is kind of the Übermensch. Raskolnikov murders to transgress, to crush. This woman, I think he describes her as a cockroach. And it's in killing her that he authenticates himself. What Nietzsche does, and what Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment epitomizes, is this: the replacement, I would say, of a moral category with an aesthetic category. What do I mean by that? Replacement of the category of right and wrong, good and evil, with conformism or transgression. And transgression becomes, if you like, the new moral virtue. And that goes, I think, in one of the questions I answered at the end of the last session. I referred to that we now have a situation where transgression has become the great moral virtue of our day. In art, in entertainment, and in politics, the transgressive has become the virtuous. My wife sometimes, I've not heard her complain like this recently, but would sometimes complain when looking at those glossy women's magazines on the shelf in Hudson's or wherever. Why is it that there's never any woman on the front of those magazines, who's just been faithful to her husband and successfully brought up her children? Maybe she's not stunningly beautiful, but she's actually made a sort of decent success of her life. Why is it always people whose lives, when you read the details of them, are kind of sewers? Because we live in an aesthetic world, not a moral world. A world that worships outward beauty and worships transgression. That's the norm. Well, what is transgression? It's a denial of limits. If there is a limit there, it is to be transgressed. There is an impatience with what is. You think of Goethe's Faust, Goethe's greatest literary production. The character of Mephistopheles so wonderfully captures so much of the modern world's mentality. And in one of his first encounters with Faust, Mephistopheles says this: "I am the spirit that always negates, and rightly so, since everything that comes into existence is only fit to go out of existence. And it would be better if nothing ever got started." That's the spirit of the modern age. We see it in art. So much of art has become transgressive. We see it in entertainment, where immorality and amorality are presented as the norm. We see it in the realm of the sexual revolution, where the constant transgressing of whatever become the established sexual norms becomes important. Just over a year ago, I was interviewed. I was asked to go on the Andrew Sullivan show. Some of you may know Andrew. I think he's a very liberal Catholic. He's also a gay man. He's HIV positive. He asked if I would go on to his show to discuss the transgender issue, because Andrew has gone into real trouble because he's a gay man who says he's not sexually attractive to women presenting as men. And that makes him a transphobe. So yesterday's radical campaigner for gay marriage becomes today's right-wing nut job. Actually, the day we did it, it was rather brutal, because on the day we did it was the day that President Biden signed the Respect for Marriage Act. I think it was Respect for Marriage Act into law. So as I'm tuning in, Andrew comes on and he says, "Oh, by the way, we're changing topic. We're going to talk about gay marriage." And I thought, oh gosh, I don't agree with you on gay marriage. I said, "How long is the podcast going to be?" And he says, 90 minutes. And I thought, oh, this is going to be so brutal. And it was. It was a long 90 minutes. But at some point, I can't remember if it was in the podcast or whether it was after the podcast, we stayed online for about 15 minutes chatting afterwards, when he expressed great disappointment that he'd not been able to make me lose my temper. He said, "You're just far too cheerful." But the other thing I made a comment to him was, you're only one up from me in the political scale now. I'm a straight white male. You're a gay white male. You have one more point than I do. But you're right at the bottom. Transgression becomes the order of the day in the sexual revolution. And what's interesting, of course, is what makes, I think, well, let me just backtrack a second and say, I'm not saying that these things are new in the modern age. The fall is a transgression. But what's new in our age, in the West, is this, that the people who shape and form our culture are committed to this vision of transgression. In the past, cultural elites were committed to the transmission of values through history. Now they are by and large committed to the transgression of values. And that makes this age somewhat different. So, in an era where limits are merely there to be transgressed, where limits are oppressive and problematic, I would suggest that natural, limited human nature is implausible. That's one element. Second element, rejection of teleology. Teleology is just a sort of pompous philosophical word for ends. The idea that things have an end. What do I mean by an end? Well, tomorrow when I jump on the plane to head back to Pittsburgh, the plane is going to have to be directed towards Pittsburgh in order for me to get there. Pittsburgh is the end. Interestingly enough, it's the first thing one considers. First thing the pilot's going to consider is, which direction do I need to point the plane to get to Pittsburgh Airport? So the final destination, the final end, will actually be the thing that shapes everything the pilot does until we arrive at our destination. But we live in a world where, by and large, the idea that human nature has an end that is intrinsic to it and intrinsic to every human being is at a premium. It's been at a premium for many years. A lot of debates go on in Christian circles about Darwin and evolution, etc., etc. Typically, they focus on debates about how to interpret the first few chapters of Genesis. I think one of the most philosophically significant moves that Darwin makes is simply his abolition of teleology. The idea that one needs an end in order to understand how everything's developed. As I read Darwin, he gets rid of that idea. There's a sense in which there's a kind of randomness, in an absolute sense, about what's happened. Human beings, if you like, have no special destiny. We've just been thrown up by the process at some point. Nietzsche offers a rigorous theological rejection of teleology. For Nietzsche, God is dead. And the question for Nietzsche is, are you therefore up to the challenge of rising up to decide your own end? Are you up to the challenge of making your own life meaningful? In some ways, he sets up the great 20th century question. If God is dead and there is no meaning, can you still make your life worth living? Are you up to that task? And we see this in various ways, not least in the great suspicion that has arisen about any attempt to sort of define normative human behavior. Concerns about oppression would fit into this. Any attempt to say, well, human beings actually flourish best if they behave in the following way is very vulnerable to saying, well, what you're actually doing there is you're taking the things that you like or the things that your culture prioritizes and demanding that everybody else conform to them. And as with a lot of claims, there's a certain amount of truth to that. I'm American and British now. When you think about the British Empire, what the British Empire did in many places was it really imposed a kind of British way of life upon cultures that were not British. My dental surgeon is a wonderful Indian woman. And there are two things that we understand and chat about before she inflicts tremendous pain upon me each time. Gin and tonics and cricket. I think two of the greatest English inventions. They're not even British. I think cricket and gin and tonics, they're English. They're English. She understands them because she grew up in India, which was deeply shaped by English, British culture. I certainly don't want to say that there isn't such a thing as cultural oppression, that there haven't been moves made where people take the incidentals of their culture and try to make them normative for everybody. But it's one thing to observe that. It's another thing to wholesale wipe out any notion that there are certain things that all human beings share in common, certain ends they share in common, to which flourishing lives should be directed. These days, to point to an end as intrinsic to what it means to be human is liable to be seen as politically oppressive. And that's problematic. Touch on what I mentioned earlier, of course, this becomes, I think, more plausible in a highly technological world. Technology really does transform the way we relate to the world around us and allows us to think that perhaps some of the things that we thought were intrinsic to human nature are not intrinsic to human nature. We can travel much faster now because we have automobiles and airplanes. We can talk across huge distances because we have telephones, video conferencing, etc., etc. Technology makes it easier and easier to think that we don't have intrinsic ends. We don't have intrinsic limits either, because technology delivers such tremendous power to us. And I would say, transgenderism. One of the things I miss in the book, but it's sort of really only emerged as a major force since I published, is that transgenderism, I think, is a species of transhumanism. What is transhumanism? Well, it's a term used to cover a group of different approaches, but they share one thing in common. What we would regard as natural human limits are there to be overcome. They're challenges to be transcended, not limits to be accepted. So we have lost the notion of limits, and we have repudiated the notion of teleology. We have also, I think, come to reject more and more the notion of obligation. This touches perhaps most directly on what I said in my first lecture. Obligations towards others have become less and less plausible as the years go by. It's happened in various ways. In some ways, it even happens in the way we work. When you think about the medieval peasant who was harvesting the crops and harvesting the potatoes to feed the family, may well have found that work very boring. But he had to do it because there was an immediate connection between failure to do it and the family starving and dying. In a world where we move from job to job and there is less direct connection between what we make with our hands or we say with our mouths or we write with our pens or type on our computers and the immediate survival or otherwise of our families, questions of obligation become more and more attenuated. We also see technology as freeing us from consequences. Again, to bring it more directly to the question before you today on the pro-life issue, think of how technology has transformed the understanding of sexual obligations. Wife and I happened to wander through a pro-abortion protest a couple of years ago now, or 18 months ago, and one of the banners being waved around which said, consent to sex is not consent to pregnancy. Yeah, it's an interesting statement that can only be made in a relatively technological society. Certainly 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, consent to sex was consent to the possibility of pregnancy for half of the people involved, we might say. Well, think about that. Technology has transformed how we think about the purpose of sex. 19th century, you're a 16, 17-year-old guy. One of your top ambitions in life is to sleep with a woman. What do you got to do? Well, by and large, you've got to be clean. You've got to have a job. You've got to be presentable. I'm a big Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Nat King Cole guy. And I sometimes joke with the students, those songs emerged from a culture where men had to wear ties to ask a girl out on a date. You got to put some effort in. Why? Well, because if you sleep with a girl and you don't have those things at your disposal, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. You can have the family coming after you and she gets pregnant. You may catch a terrible disease for which there is no cure. There are consequences to sexual activity in a non-technological society. You realize that you have responsibilities to the other person because it's not going to be so easy to escape from the consequences of your own action. Once you have antibiotics and easy access to things like the pill, etc., the way one imagines sex to function is transformed within society. It ceases to be about the union of man and wife and procreation and becomes recreational. You need technology to make that imaginative leap within the culture. So, it has an impact on the sexual revolution. Think as well in odd ways about how technology, in odd ways, reshapes the way we think about our obligations towards others. One of the things I played with over recent months is the way that we experience music. When you think about music, let's say in the mid-19th century, well, music is sort of a universal, as far as I can see it, is a human universal, and it fulfills communal purposes. Parties, dances, funerals, weddings, celebrations, lamentations connect to communal music. If you want to enjoy music, if you want to experience music in the 19th century, you've got to be part of a communal production. You've got to be present at a communal production. Music represents the community and binds the community together. These days, music is primarily experienced individually. It's gone from a communal production to an individual item of consumption. Not exactly sure of the significance of that, but I am sure that it is significant. I joke when I get on a plane, I always love it when the person sitting next to me puts their earbuds in, because I know I can get on with reading my book and I don't have to engage in a conversation. But isn't it interesting how the person getting on the plane puts the earbuds in? Music is there to separate us as individuals rather than draw us together as a community. We see a similar phenomenon in dancing, of course. I set up my humanities course at Grove. One of the first classes, I show a slide, and on the one half of the slide, there's a picture of the dance scene from the BBC production of Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Darcy and the Miss Bennets getting it on the dance floor. And on the other slide, I have a John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever, which to me is a relatively recent movie. I'm lucky if my kids' parents were born when that movie was put out. For me, if it's not black and white and doesn't involve Gene Kelly or Fred Astaire, it's not really a classic movie, as far as I am concerned. But I point out, I look at the difference in imaginative worlds there. In the one scene, Mr. Darcy only makes sense when he takes account of everybody else and shapes his dance moves in relation to everybody else. He's not an individual. He's part of a corporate whole. 19th century, we move to the waltz and the foxtrot. The guy and the girl have to coordinate with each other. 20th century, we move to John Travolta, just strutting his stuff on the dance floor, expressing who he is in this dance-off competition for the heart of the girl. Think about how that shapes the imagination. It tilts us towards thinking of ourselves and reflects a society where we think of ourselves more and more as individuals and less as part of a corporate whole. Think about the body. I've already mentioned this, so I won't go into any detail, but the disembodiment of our world tilts us away from obligation. I'm fascinated. Mary Harrington's book, Feminism Against Progress. If you haven't read it, it's an amazing book. And the opening of that book is she says that she does something very clever. And Mary Harrington lived a sort of wild, queer existence before she got married and had a child. And she said the thing that really puzzled her was after she'd given birth to her daughter, she couldn't stop thinking of her daughter as part of her body. She's playing on that sort of feminist trope, but inverting the purpose. And she says, and therefore, I couldn't get over the fact that I had an ineradicable obligation to this child who was still part of my body. But when you start thinking about yourself as disembodied, as I said last time, you stop thinking about natural bodily obligations. I would recommend Mary Harrington's book. I'd also recommend the work of my two colleagues at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Carter Sneed and Erica Bakioki, on the issue of embodiment and natural obligation. And all of this, I think, is theologically significant. You know, it's not just culturally, which I've done, but we're Christians here. It's theologically significant because all of this stuff, rejection of obligation, rejection of ends, rejection of limits, makes us feel like God. It's exhilarating. It's exhilarating. Again, Dostoevsky is rapidly becoming my favorite author. Here is a quotation from Dostoevsky, written from his Notes from a Dead House, which is his sort of semi-fictionalized account of his own incarceration in Siberia, in a Siberian camp. And at various points, he reflects upon the other inmates. And here he is reflecting upon an inmate who's what we would call today a serial killer. And he's reflecting on what motivated this man, as he says, is this: as if, this is when the man first kills, as if, having leapt over a line that was sacred to him, he begins to admire the fact that nothing is holy for him anymore. As if he feels an urge to leap over all legality and authority at once, and to revel in the most boundless and unbridled freedom, to revel in this thrill of horror, which is impossible for him not to feel. I think he's anticipating the psychology of the early Raskolnikov there. But notice that breaching of the rules, that breaking of the sacred became addictive to this man. One of the interesting developments, is it not, in the abortion debate has been how abortion has gone from being safe, legal, and rare to being something that people shout loud and celebrate. That makes sense, I think, in light of Dostoevsky's insight there into the thrill that desecration brings in its wake. So how should the church respond in the last 10 minutes? Let's think about this. And this is where I think Anglicanism, I want to suggest that the church has, humanly speaking, at its disposal, all the tools it needs to respond to this. We shouldn't overcomplicate the answer. The Lord gives the increase, and whether we choose to use the tools, well, that's up to us. But here, I think, is how we can respond. And here I borrow and adapt a quotation from the late, great Lutheran theologian Robert Jensen. He says, and I'm borrowing here, but I'm adding my own twist in. The obvious answer is that if the church does not find her hearers inhabiting a world of limits, teleology, and obligation, then the church herself must be that world. If we find ourselves, if you like, in a world where limits, teleology, and obligation are disregarded, then we have to do it ourselves. We have to be the world of limits, teleology, and obligation. How do we do that? First of all, teaching. You say, well, that's not any great insight. Doesn't the church teach? Particularly the Protestant church teaches. Of course. I do think, though, it's helpful to realize that sometimes we need to, I wouldn't say adapt our teaching because that implies doctrinal change, but we need to focus our teaching on certain things that are of particular pressing importance in certain ages. Where is the pressure today? I would say it's on creation and its significance. I'm not talking here about the usual debates about timetabling, interpretation of Genesis 1, etc., etc. I think the significance of creation for what we are as human beings that then shapes who we think we are as individuals. We need a robust understanding of creation and of human beings made in the image of God in order to teach limits and teleology and obligation. I think the problem is when we divorce our ethics from a deeper understanding of creation anthropology, we end up with a set of do's and don'ts. And they don't particularly work with a lot of young people today. Where I feel the pressure most, I suppose, because of the stuff I've written, is when young people at Grove City College will come and ask me, what does the Bible teach about homosexuality? I'll point them to the text, but I know that at the back of their mind there's a second, very legitimate question. And the legitimate question is this: why does the Bible teach that? Is it just because God wants my good gay friends to be miserable? So you've got to give that person more than a do or a don't. You have to point them to the overall understanding of human beings created in the image of God and say, actually, God has set these rules there because these rules are the best ways for human beings to actually be who they truly are. And you tend to collide with things if you don't follow them. I think the one good punch I landed with my Andrew Sullivan interview was when at some point I said to him, Andrew, and I won't use the particular words here, but I basically said, look, Andrew, certain parts of the male anatomy are designed to be inserted in certain parts of the female anatomy. Certain parts of the female anatomy are designed to receive certain parts of the male anatomy. And that's the way the body is constructed. His comment to me, he rather facetiously said, you mean the wrong whole argument? And I said, yes. Yes, my wife was cringing on the sofa as she heard me say this. But I'm thinking, and he sort of said, you sort of got a point there. I'm thinking, well, you're an HIV positive man. You're a good guy, you're an intelligent guy, I'm enjoying my conversation with you. But you've got HIV. You feel the power of what I've just said there because you're bearing the consequences of having ignored the rules. And the rules weren't there to inhibit you from being yourself. The rules are there to protect you from seriously damaging your body at that point. A good doctrine of creation, I think, is very important for a compassionate communication of ethics. Creed and teaching. Secondly, and here I really am, I used this phrase yesterday, it's one that probably doesn't compute into it, carrying coals to Newcastle. Newcastle's a big industrial port in England. It's where all the coal was exported to the empire. Nobody privately takes coal to Newcastle. They've got more than they need. Here I'm carrying coals to Newcastle. Liturgy. Why is liturgy important in this? Well, first of all, one might say that liturgy, just by its very form, imposes limits. It imposes limits. Every church has liturgy. The Anglicans, Roman Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox have it in a particularly elaborate form. But all churches that I'm aware of, for example, will sing hymns or praise songs where the form is set. It's not worship by scat singing. Everybody sings the same words. You're limited when you go to a worship service to follow the order of worship. So just as a form, liturgy is a reminder of limits. But also I would say a good liturgy, both in word and action, shapes the imagination towards teleology. A good liturgy is meant to be an anticipation of heaven on earth. A good liturgy is to make sense of the here and now in the context of that to which it points as an end. Teleology is very important for making sense of the here and now. Psalm 73, the psalmist, who nearly stumbles because of, we would say, the theodicy question, the fact that the bad guys live long, prosperous lives and the good guys die young and in misery. He almost stumbles until he goes to the sanctuary, the place where the covenant God meets with his covenant people. And then he says, and then their end became clear to me. I looked to the end and the here and now made sense. Paul says a not dissimilar thing in 2 Corinthians, where he talks about all of his woes and suffering and then says, and yet, this is but a light momentary affliction in comparison with the eternal weight of glory that is to come. The teleology makes sense of the present moment. Painful as that moment is, as it's happening, yet it still makes sense. A good liturgy is teleological. Think of evening prayer in your own tradition. The New Testament lesson, followed by the Nunc Dimittis, the Song of Simeon. You're confronted with Christ, and then you immediately declare, hey, now your servant can depart in peace. Now I'm ready. I've seen the end of all things. Now I'm ready for my personal end. A good liturgy will cultivate an imagination that thinks teleologically relative to the Christian gospel. Perhaps some of you here are not Anglicans. You're just here because you're supportive of this particular ministry. But I hope in your church there is a teleology to the liturgy. There will be perhaps a reading of the law, a confession of sin, an announcement, a declaration of forgiveness, a reading of the gospel, a benediction at the end, that there will be a dramatic rhythm. Dorothy L. Sayers' great statement, the drama is the dogma. Or the dogma is the drama. We might say the liturgy is the drama. And dramas shape imaginations. Robert Jensen again says this: in the postmodern world, if a congregation or churchly agency wants to be relevant, and he puts relevant there in scare quotes, here is the first step. It must recover the classic liturgy of the church in all of its dramatic density, sensual activity, and brutal realism, and make this the one exclusive center of its life. And I would also say worship is to be adult and serious. Again, in London 2 weeks ago, my wife and I on the Friday, we were staying in a hotel down by Buckingham Palace. We went for a wander around Westminster Cathedral, the great Roman Catholic cathedral in London. It's a beautiful Byzantine building. And one of the things I said to my wife was, the people who built this building wanted something adult to go on here. It's magnificent. It grips the imagination. I don't agree with all of Catholic theology by any means, but it's clearly taken seriously by the people who built that building, and it was grown up. It impressed. It had an impressive... I'm actually impressed by the Presbyterian nature of this Anglican church. Other than the cross and the slightly off-center placing of the pulpit, could be a Presbyterian church. Well done. Lord's Supper, serious matter. Protestantism has done well in the speaking of the gospel. I think we're challenged in the liturgy to do well in the showing of the gospel as well. And then finally, how do we teach obligation? Well, some of that comes from communal singing and communal liturgy. One of the great innovations or restorations of the Reformation was Martin Luther brought corporate singing back. But I also think it connects to the way of life. I'm very struck that hospitality is a mark of qualification for eldership in the church. I give a whole lecture on eldership and ministry, but I would suggest that the qualifications for ministry, with the possible exception of teaching, are really things to which all Christians should aspire. Don't get drunk, organize your family well, show hospitality. The leaders of the church are to epitomize those virtues so that everybody else emulates. In other words, if your child says to you, who should I be like when I grow up? You should be able to point to your minister or the elders and say, you want to be like that guy. Because his Christian walk really does capture something of what the New Testament is pointing to. Hospitality teaches us about our obligations towards others. It's an attribute of God. It's how God expresses his obligation towards his people, isn't it? I am the Lord your God who loves the widow, the orphan, and the sojourner. So you too should love the sojourner, for you were sojourners in Egypt. Obligation is right there, and hospitality is a way of demonstrating that. I said yesterday, I still remember the name, Effie Morrison, of the woman who the first day I was in Aberdeen in my postgraduate studies went to church on the Sunday morning. Wasn't a Presbyterian or anything at that point. Just went to this Presbyterian church, sat down in the pew, and the little old lady in the pew in front of me turned around and said, "You new here, do you have anywhere to go to lunch?" That was nearly 36 years ago, and I still remember her name. Effie Morrison. Hospitality is that great reminder of the obligations we have towards each other. And I would also suggest friendship. This would take me in a tangent, but I would suggest that a lot of the sexual chaos we see among our young people today is because they no longer know what friendship is. We have failed to teach them friendship. Chatting to a young life worker in the last 18 months, my office, and he said to me that he was doing young life in one of the local high schools, he said, and 80% of the girls in the 12-year-old girls there claim to be lesbian. I said, well, that's an amazing statistic compared to the national average. What do you think's going on? And he says they have no idea what friendship is. He said they feel strong feelings for each other, which is perfectly natural. And there's nothing inappropriate about that at all. And the only grid that society now gives them to think about those feelings is a sexualized one. Because he said we've lost the concept of friendship. One of my guilty pleasures as a Presbyterian is John Henry Newman. I'll be teaching Newman class this semester at Grove. Love Newman. Don't love where he ended up, but he is a great man and a godly man and captures so much of the spirit of his age as a Christian. But if you read his letters, he's a beautiful letter writer. Some of the letters he writes to his male friends, if you read them today, you think he's a homosexual. You think he's gay because he writes with such passion to other men. But oddly enough, that was merely the way that rather uptight Victorian Englishmen, and I'm just a rather uptight non-Victorian Englishman, it was the way they expressed themselves in private to each other. There was nothing salacious about it at all. It was just an expression of deep, passionate friendship. Friendship, the church should be a place that models friendship. So, as I draw to a close, the problem of the modern world, of which abortion is a function, is we really don't know what it means to be human anymore. And three significant aspects of that are we refuse to accept limits, we have no teleology, and we deny obligations towards each other. How can the church respond to that? Teaching, liturgy, community. Not rocket science. Very simple things, and as Anglicans, you have a head start with the Book of Common Prayer over the rest of us. Very, very simple moves. As I said, only the Lord can give the increase. But he certainly won't give the increase if we're not actually doing what we should be doing. Thank you for listening so patiently. A few minutes for a couple more questions.
All right. Like I said, drinking from the fire hydrant. I appreciate everything you had to say, and I can't wait to go back and listen to it 2 or 3 more times. It is, every sentence is just filled with such knowledge and truth. We had a gentleman, or I assumed it was a gentleman. He asks a question, and I'm now, as I read it one more time, he asked it from your first lecture. Yeah. And I'm not sure that I'm going to get this right, and he might need to type in a clarifying statement. What would you recommend to a father whose daughter has partnered with a woman who performs transgender surgery and is now a grandfather? So I'm not sure if he's referring to the fact that the daughter and the woman who's performing transgender surgery, bottom line, I think he's asking, yep, how do I handle this in my family?
Yeah. Very difficult question. And one of the problems, of course, is a lot of this stuff is happening so fast that many of us, and I include myself in this, are works in progress in how we respond to questions like that. My instincts are this. One, first of all, don't suffer alone. You will not be the only person going through this. And there are online websites that can connect you to other people who are going through the same thing. And one of the things I would say is talk to other people. Ask what they've done, what has worked and what has not worked. Secondly, I think do not lose sight of the fact that whatever the confusions or the sins or whatever of your daughter and this other person are, they're still made in the image of God. And one wants to respond with love and compassion to them. Now, what love and compassion looks like is not necessarily what the world says it looks like. And then you're getting into the area of, I'd need to know more, every situation has its own uniquenesses. So you'd need to be much more closer to the situation to have precise advice at that stage. My third thing would be keep lines of communication open. I do think there's much to be said for, if they're not talking to you, to whom are they talking? And I'm very aware of that as when I write and when I speak. And I very rarely, if ever, sign any petition or anything simply on the basis of, well, how's this thing going to be used? Who's it going to cut me off from speaking to? And if I'm not speaking to that person, who are they speaking to? So I would say try to keep lines of communication open. And of course, pray. Pray for wisdom. But above all, I go back to my first point, don't suffer alone. I mean, if your child has terminal cancer, what's one of the first things you do? You want to talk to other people who are going through the same thing. I would say find other people, and they are out there struggling with the same thing, and talk to them.
Great, thank you. Any other questions by anybody this afternoon?
Georgette,
or as we
we
get
have
into
one here.
Oh, sir. With abortion being legally over, but it's still going on, and taking 50 years for that to transpire, with these other cultural things like transgenderism and LGBTQ, is there anything in history that you see that kind of gives us a roadmap or an analogy for length of time for these things to kind of run their course?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If you'd asked me that question 18 months ago, I'd have said, it's not going to happen. None of this is going to change much in my lifetime. And I'd then have qualified that by saying, but let us not forget that short-termism is also an aspect of modernity. That, the idea that everything has to happen in my lifetime, that's not something that previous generations would necessarily have seen as significant. They built buildings that took generations to build because they were worth doing, not because the individuals who laid the foundations were going to enjoy them. I am actually relatively optimistic on the transgender issue at this point. There are pushbacks coming. Of all places, some of them are coming in Europe. Even a place like Sweden is beginning to have second thoughts about some of the excesses of the transgender question. So I think that could well be resolved in my lifetime in the right direction. And I could be wrong. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to happen, but it's interesting to me that pushback is coming. The tragedy is that I think that will be changed because a large number of people will have had their lives destroyed by it. And this is America, so they're going to sue. And it sounds awful when we say this, I hope the people they sue are bankrupted and if possible go to prison. I think there's some very evil people out there profiting from this stuff. But I think that's coming. We're beginning to see the sort of the early earthquakes on that happening. I think that's coming. On the issue of, say, gay marriage, I don't see any change in that. I think that's here to stay for the indefinite future. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be, at least in our churches, exemplifying what good and healthy and loving marriages look like. It's one thing to change the legislation of the culture, but that's not our primary purpose as a church. I would say to the students, I don't think the primary purpose of the church is to transform the culture. I think the primary purpose of the church is to be a culture and to represent what walking to the beat of a different drum looks like to the world around. And I think that's our task at the moment. I don't want to quote, everybody quotes that bit in The Lord of the Rings about, it's not for us, I wish I didn't live at these times, but it's not for us to decide. But that's Gandalf is pretty wise in that situation. I think, let's just get on and be the church. Let's take the public and civic opportunities we have to protect the innocent. Let us try to stop children's bodies being mutilated by transgender crazy people, activists. Let us press for changes on abortion laws. Let us press for a change in the social imaginary on these issues. But let us also realize that where we can have most effect is in our local congregations. That's where we can be an alternative culture.
All right, we are at our limit. Oh, we have one more question here. All right, let's go ahead and ask that one.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
so much. Part of the problem that I see with young girls is that they see men on sort of a pedestal, and they sort of do whatever they can to achieve what they see men being able to do, because they feel like their body is limiting them. They can't be as strong, or when they get pregnant, they can't do certain things. So how can we help young girls see, and what can we say to young girls to see the beauty of what God's creation of the female body is and how that involves pregnancy and having children?
That's a very good question. Thanks for asking that. Would require a huge, long answer to answer it thoroughly. But I would say one of the things that I've been most encouraged by in the last couple of years is the emergence of sort of pro-life feminism. And I mentioned Mary Harrington's book. And I would also recommend to you a book by a good friend of mine, Erika Bakioki, called The Rights of Women. And what she calls for in that book is a re-understanding of an understanding of what it means to be a woman that isn't going back to a kind of 1950s model. An understanding of being a woman that sees women as having huge potential in the public sphere, huge professional potential, but also as those who need to understand the obligations their bodies place upon them. And what Erika does so well is she also says, but men need to realize that too, that this cannot be achieved just by telling women how to be women. We actually need to educate men and women both in how to be men and how to be women. So rather than try to summarize all her book in detail, I would recommend you get it. It's a little expensive, but she is working on a popular version at the moment. You probably get it from a public library, from a school library. Erika Bakioki, The Rights of Women. I would strongly recommend that you look at that. And also what she does there, interesting enough, is she looks at some of the origins of feminism and how pro-life it was in certain sections in the early days, and how pro-life feminism sort of lost the argument. And I think you would find that helpful. Thanks. Thanks for asking the question.